Warning. Please note that this topic might make you uncomfortable and sad, otherwise sit tight. A rate of killing 4 times greater than the height of the Nazi Holocaust, using low-tech weapons largely of machetes. The Rwandan Genocide 1994 only lasted 100 days, however, at a rate in which 6 people were killed every minute, approximately 800,000 killed in total. It was sadly a planned extermination of an entire race, the Tutsi, by the Hutu. What could have caused this devastating event? There were 3 main contributing reasons that caused the Rwandan genocide: pre-colonial political tension, European colonialism, and the evolution of the human capital and resource scarcity. European colonialism caused the genocide to a high extent, racializing Tutsi and Hutu, and pre-colonial tension caused it to a high extent, as it laid a foundation for the genocide, and the evolution of the human capital and resource scarcity to a moderate extent, as it defined the scope of the event. Before we jump right into the topic of pre-colonial tensions, it is important to understand that Rwanda's history was told through oral traditions and stories. This meant that, well, there are no reliable written records of the pre-colonial state of Rwanda. Anything that I'm going to say about pre-colonial Rwanda is my theory, so please feel free to disagree. Political tensions between Tutsi and Hutu that arose from the change in clientship and state expansion in the 19th century Rwanda by Mwami Kigeli highly contributed towards the genocide. Rwanda is a small country in Africa. Its geography made it a desirable place to settle, with frequent rain yearly making it easier for agriculture. Its highlands also acted as protection from the tsetse fly, which kills livestock, and mosquitoes, which cause malaria. There were 2 main groups that lived there: Hutu and Tutsi. They weren't really distinct ethnical groups. Rather, they were more like hierarchical structures. Hutu were the vassals cultivating their land, and Tutsi were the aristocrats, which herded cattle. The structure was like this as cattle was worth more than produce. They spoke the same language, had the same culture, and lived alongside each other. It sounds peaceful, doesn't it? But it wasn't the case. Changes in the 3 types of clientship, umuhito, abahake, and uburetwa, highlighted the inequality between the client and the patron. Umuhito was the first form of clientship. The client would pay periodic gifts of cattle to patrons in exchange for protection. However, this restricted the patron to those with cattle. Ubuhake, the second form of clientship, allowed a greater number of clients and patrons. The patron would lend the use of cattle to the client for service. Because most Tutsis owned cattle, the Hutu had to provide service and farm produce in return for protection and cattle, emphasizing the political difference. This stratification was later exacerbated by the new Tutsi Mwami, Kigeli Rwabugiri, who introduced uburetwa in an effort to expand his power. This clientship was mainly imposed on Hutu lineage, where appointed hill chiefs, informally or formally known as Tutsis, would take control of Hutu land by right of occupation. The Hutu had to provide manual labor as payment for their occupation of land. This polarized the social difference between Hutu and Tutsi, making Rwanda appear as Tutsi-ruled land. However, despite rising tensions from these reasons, Tutsi and Hutu were still social groups, not ethical groups like what they were by the time of the genocide. There has to be other reasons. European colonialism caused the genocide to a significant extent, changing the subject-power distinction, racializing Hutu and Tutsi as identities. There are 2 main reasons of colonialism that racialized them. The first was the obsession over race science, leading to the strong presence of the Hamitic hypothesis in Rwanda, portraying Tutsi as alien and Hutu as indigenous. The second is the census in 1933, leading to the introduction of identity cards in the next year. Rwanda was first claimed by Germany in the 1890s and was given to Belgium after Germany lost in World War I. In the late 19th century, when Germany was ruling Rwanda, the concept of race science dominated Europe, and pseudoscientific social Darwinism meant that people were ranked hierarchically. Because of this, the Hamitic hypothesis was able to become a critical factor in the racialization. When the Europeans arrived in Rwanda, they saw that Tutsis fitted the description of Hamites, the superior group in the hypothesis. They also saw that the Hutus, much shorter and dark-skinned, appeared much like a subordinate race under the expansion of Tutsi power by Mwami Kigeli IV. They assumed that this was the natural arrangement. As the Hamitic hypothesis spread under European rule, the Tutsi started to see themselves as a natural ruler. And in 1898, after Kigali's death in 1895, a dual colonialism system was created. A Tutsi leader would rule along with a German colonist in exchange for sponsorship, which protected them against the Hutu, assuring Tutsi superiority. By the time Rwanda was given to Belgium following Germany's loss in World War I, Hutu and Tutsi were no longer seen as hierarchical classes but as different races. Under Belgian indirect rule, all remaining Hutu chiefs were replaced with Tutsi equivalents, eradicating Hutu from all political positions. This divide was made complete through the introduction of identity cards in 1934 following the successful census in 1933, defining both as different races. Through this, European colonialism exacerbated the existing social-political distinction between Tutsi and Hutu, racializing them, drastically increasing the previous tensions. The evolution of the human capital and resource scarcity is a moderate cause that more importantly defined the severity of the Rwandan genocide, increasing the number of Hutu participants to a rate surpassing the Holocaust. Prior to colonialism, parents and relatives educated their children regarding Rwandan culture and values in a community-based system called Itorero. This was changed in 1908 as Catholic missionaries introduced the modern Rwandan school. However, despite the goal to evangelize the population and educate the future leaders of Rwanda, bias was not absent. Tutsis were provided with meat-based meals and milk, while Hutus were provided with traditional maize, porridge and beans. Later curriculums further highlighted the difference between Tutsi and Hutu, reinforcing the idea that Tutsi were dominant and Hutu subservient. Even if a Hutu completed secondary education or post-secondary education, job opportunities were limited to labor-intensive vocations or the seminary, breeding a growing frustration and embitterment among the Hutu population. But just when you thought that Tutsi superiority would continue to thrive, situation changed, especially as the new clergy came to Rwanda after World War II. Strongly influenced by anti-racist ideology current and coming from relatively humble origins different to the past conservative leaders of the Rwanda Church, the new clergy had great empathy towards the Hutu masses. And by 1951, this shifting attitude became more prevalent within the church as the number of black, primarily Tutsi Rwandan priests increased, threatening the power of the white missionaries. During this time, Belgians also decided that Tutsi were no longer reliable partners as educated Tutsi started to agitate for self-government. Suddenly, policies were modified favorably towards Hutus, relegating Tutsi to second class. However, Tutsis were still wealthy, which brought unrest between a greater suffering Hutu population, as new laws abolishing obligatoire were introduced by Belgians in 1954, as they saw it as an indentured servitude. In result, the creation of a new landless class of Hutu who possessed cattle, in which they had to compete with others for grazing land. This in turn led to environmental degradation and increased ethnic tensions. Do you still remember the church's changing preference for Hutus? Because of this, the church allowed educated Hutus to use the church's weekly publication, Kinyamateka, to spread their views and debate prominent issues, which radicalized the latent conflict. This changing use of the media led to the eventual victory of the Hutu political party, which eventually led to Rwanda's independence in 1962. Following independence, the Hutu regime continued to use available human capital as propaganda against the Tutsi. But 1986 was when the prices of the main exports, coffee and tea, crashed on the world market, with a significant devaluation of the Rwanda currency following, increasing the economic tensions. Taking advantage of this situation, the Hutu government manipulated the suffering Hutus by developing a mechanism for the pooling and distribution of assets from Tutsis killed, due to the perceived concentration of assets in the hands of Tutsis. The evolution of the human capital led to educated Hutus who were able to manipulate more Hutus into the participation of the Rwanda genocide. Resource scarcity led to a greater suffering population of Hutus participating. Colonialism is the most significant cause of the Rwandan Genocide, exacerbating pre-colonial tensions racializing alien Tutsis from indigenous Hutus. However, without the pre-colonial tensions from clientship and expansion of the state, colonialism wouldn't have generated the genocide. And finally, the evolution of the human capital and resource scarcity contributed to the genocide to a moderate extent, mainly contributing to the severity and scope of the event.